Hey everybody, welcome to a special edition of the Philly Public Health Chats. Today is Wednesday, November the 6th. The election has been called and former President Donald J. Trump has been elected to a second non-consecutive term as the 47th President of the United States. One of the things that we do want to talk about for this special edition is the role that the President has in setting public health policy, especially around vaccination. We will talk a lot about vaccination in this episode, but this can be applicable to many other public health initiatives, public health projects, and public health interventions. My guest for this special edition is Brian Dean Abramson. He's a leading expert on vaccine law, and he was the founding chair of the National Vaccine Law Conference. He teaches law as an adjunct professor of vaccine law at Florida International University College of Law and at the University of Houston Law Center. He is also the author of Vaccine, Vaccination, and Immunization Law, which is one of the most comprehensive books written in respect to the field of law. His treatise was published by Bloomberg Law in cooperation with the American Health Law Association in November 2018, and the third edition will be forthcoming this 2025. Brian previously worked for Bloomberg Law, for whom he authored the Vaccine Injury Claims chapter of the Honorable Matthew H. Solemson's Court of Federal Claims, Jurisdiction, Practice, and Procedure, and for whom he wrote extensively in the fields of health and international privacy law. Brian was also a law clerk for the Honorable Pauline Newman of the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, where he took an exceptional interest in the court's vaccine injury docket. And prior to that, he interned with the Honorable Susan G. Braden of the U.S. Court of Federal Claims and practiced intellectual property law with the firm of Lott and Friedland in Coral Gables, Florida. He received an MA in Comparative Sociology from Florida International University, followed by his JD Summa from the Florida International University College of Law, and an LLM in Intellectual Property Law with highest honors from the George Washington University Law School. So needless to say, Brian is very well prepared and knowledgeable in the aspects of the law, the Constitution, the limits of the law, the powers of the president, and the administration as it has to do with public health. So with that, we are going to jump right into the discussion with Brian about what a president could do with regards to vaccination and public health, what are the limits of the president's power, and what could possibly happen. As always, the views and opinions in this podcast are those of the speakers and not necessarily those of their academic and professional affiliates. Thank you for joining us, and we're off to the discussion with Brian. Hey, Brian, how are you?
Dr. Najera, it is always a pleasure to see you.
Likewise, always glad to have you on and talk about these issues. We are here November 6th after the election that was called this morning for the Republican candidate. Mr. Trump will be the 47th president of the United States. And some of his policies with regards to public health have been already mentioned by him or his people in his campaign, one of them being RFK Jr., who is, for all intents and purposes, an anti-vaccine activist. He has been very vocal about his opposition to vaccination, more recently about fluoridation in the water. Also, Project 2025, which was written by followers of Mr. Trump, includes in it a lot of interventions against public health programs and public health delivery of public health in the United States. And so as an expert in the law, I wanted to have you on to talk to us about constitutional powers of the president and any other extra constitutional powers that he might exercise to affect public health in the United States. I wanted to begin with the basics. I wanted to explain to the audience that public health in the United States is very local. If you could talk to us a little bit about that and then how we work our way to the power that the president could have on public health.
Well, yes, thank you. There are certainly some specific statements. One that he made during the campaign very recently that he would, and I want to quote this exactly, he would let Robert F. Kennedy Jr. run wild on the public health agencies. Another, he was asked in an interview whether he would consider banning some vaccines, and he said he would consider it. And that, of course, that goes beyond considerations of government not actively promoting vaccines to suggest banning of vaccines. In fact, that is something that we have seen in the Southwest District of Idaho within the past few weeks. The Public Health District has banned the distribution of vaccines by that public health entity, and it's or specifically the COVID-19 vaccine. And that is the first time that we have ever seen a public health entity say, okay, we're going to bar our own distribution of a certain vaccine, even to people who are looking to be vaccinated, who voluntarily want to be vaccinated, or in circumstances where they're perhaps indigent or homeless or bedridden or something of that sort and can't access vaccination without assistance. So it is correct that most public health policy is local, is carried out locally. There are a couple of different levels of it, and some of those levels give us particular concern. One being that all vaccines are prescription pharmaceutical products. So they have to be licensed by the Federal Food and Drug Administration, and any pharmaceutical product that is not licensed is generally not legal to distribute. So if you have a product and it's not licensed, then a doctor can't prescribe it, a pharmacy can't carry it. It's an unlicensed product. There is an exception for that was used during the pandemic for what's called emergency use authorization, where the Department of Health and Human Services can allow an unlicensed product temporarily to be on the market in response to a specific emergency. Now, all of the COVID-19 vaccines that are available now are licensed vaccines, and all of the other vaccines, generally the childhood vaccines that we think of, measles, mumps, rubella, polio, tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, and so forth, those are all licensed vaccines. But Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in particular has made statements, and these tend to be incorrect statements, saying, for example, that these vaccines have never been tested in a placebo study and therefore should not have been licensed in the first place. And that's wrong on two levels. One being that a lot of vaccines have been tested in placebo studies, and it's possible to find particular studies for particular vaccines. But another being that there's no scientific reason that you need to do a placebo study specifically. So, for example, if you have an existing measles vaccine that's been in use for 40 or 50 years, and you have a new measles vaccine that a manufacturer has developed, and they want to test it, doesn't make sense to give a bunch of people a fake measles vaccine that's actually a placebo and has no effect and is going to leave them vulnerable to measles, when you can give one group of people the original measles vaccine and a second group of people this new improved measles vaccine, and compare their effects and determine in that way, is the new one in fact as safe or safer, as effective or more effective than the previous vaccine. But FDA does make that determination, does have the power as a federal agency to withdraw licensure of products from the market if there is evidence, for a number of different reasons. If there's evidence that the information given to the FDA in the licensure process was incorrect, or that there is some health risk to those products that has not been disclosed by the manufacturers. So there is a definite concern that specifically if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or other people like Surgeon General Lopato of Florida, who's being touted as a potential Trump administration appointee in a public health space, perhaps Secretary of Health and Human Services, who has made statements questioning vaccines in much the same vein. If they were to be in a position of power over the agency, they could order the agency to withdraw the licensure of the vaccines, of childhood vaccines generally, and then it wouldn't matter what the state policies were. There wouldn't be a vaccine that legally could be administered to children in the United States as an entirety. So, parents who really wanted to have their children vaccinated would, in that circumstance, have to take them to another country. If you have an opportunity to vaccinate yourself or your children for something right now, if you're due for a Tdap booster, and you're supposed to get a Tdap, that's the tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, every 10 years, but you don't actually, there's no consequence where if you do it after 5 or 6 years as opposed to 10 years, it's not going to cause you any harm. It's just that the 10-year period is the expected period during which it might wear off. If you're going to be due for a Tdap booster within the next 4 years, you might want to consider getting it before January 20th, 2025. That's not to say that there is no legal recourse if manufacturers of vaccines and physicians administering the vaccines want to contest that. They would be able to go to court. They might be able to get some kind of injunctive relief against the revocation of licensure of the vaccines, but it's kind of a dicey proposition at this point. One of the reasons why it is because during President Trump's first term in office, he was able to appoint a substantial number of federal judges. There are certain circuits, the Fifth Circuit, for example, that have been particularly heavily impacted by this. And we've seen a lot of litigation when the Biden administration imposed its own vaccination mandates. We saw people filing lawsuits very quickly in the Fifth Circuit, hoping to have that circuit and those judges be the ones to weigh in on it. And some of those judges did and have weighed in to various effects. For example, holding the Biden administration mandates unconstitutional, and more recently, holding unconstitutional the appointment of members in a case called Braidwood v. Becerra, the appointment of members of an advisory commission within the Department of Health and Human Services that advises on certain preventative care, that because they advise on that preventative care under the Affordable Care Act, it has to be covered by insurance carriers. The Fifth Circuit just held that the appointment of that board was not constitutionally sufficient with respect to a clause in the Constitution that requires certain officers of government to be confirmed by the Senate. There is another board, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, as you well know, that makes recommendations on vaccination, and their recommendations also are required under the Affordable Care Act to be covered by insurers. And their existence, their authority to make such recommendations, has been challenged in the same litigation. Now, the Fifth Circuit did not hold in Braidwood that ACIP is unconstitutionally appointed. They kind of put that to the side, but they didn't say that it's correct and constitutional either. They left it sort of, well, that's an issue to be decided. The case has been appealed to the Supreme Court, both by the government and by the individual plaintiffs. The government, currently the Biden administration, asking the Supreme Court to find that the other board that makes recommendations on preventative care was constitutionally appointed, does have the power to act as it does, with the plaintiffs in the case asking the Supreme Court to find that the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices was appointed, and therefore its recommendations on vaccine schedules and coverage would not carry the legal weight that they currently do. So there are multiple levels of concern, and there is certainly a concern that if there is an attempt to revoke licensure of vaccines, there might be some effort, some manipulation to try and get that heard by a particular court that the government thinks is one that will rule in its favor based on this sort of history of appointments. Plaintiffs generally do have the choice of court, so that would be a little bit more difficult, but not impossible that it might end up in an unfavorable court or in front of an unfavorable judge based on the appointment of some number of judges who we have seen a definite uptick over the course of the pandemic with judges who are sort of buying into misinformation about vaccines in making their decisions. So, that would be concerning to see.
Now, going on some of the history of other medications, just from, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but from things that I've heard, could a state, for example, California, say, nope, we're going to buy the drugs, in this case, the vaccines, and bring them in and use them on our citizens? Is this power because of the interstate control that the federal government would have, or the international import of something internationally? Could California set up its own lab and develop its own vaccines and distribute them within its own territory?
Well, I think any state would have the power to set up a lab and develop vaccines, but they would still need to go to the FDA to have them licensed. And in fact, it doesn't often make sense for a state to go to that effort because vaccines have already been developed and are constantly being developed, refined, improved by the companies that manufacture the vaccines on a commercial basis. But whether California could distribute a vaccine that's not licensed, I think would be problematic. And I think we have seen this issue arise with the question of medical marijuana, which technically is federally prohibited. The kind of grace that states have had, where you have a large number of states now that are permitting medical marijuana, is that the federal government has chosen the presidential administrations, successively over the past several administrations, including the previous Trump administration, have chosen not to enforce those laws. Of course, that is one of the aspects of Project 25, and there are some people politically on that side who say, oh no, we should enforce those laws, and you may find that there is a more stringent federal regulation or federal prevention of the use of marijuana for medical purposes. There are kind of four major areas that we're looking at in terms of kinds of pharmaceutical products. So no one's talking about the federal government's going to stop you from taking aspirin or Lipitor or thyroid medication if that's prescribed for you. But there are concerns about, first of all, medical marijuana. Secondly, abortion drugs and contraceptive drugs. Thirdly, vaccines, and fourthly, opiates and opioids. There have been definite problems with the distribution of opioids, and that is something that a lot of states have tried to address. Some states have tried to put more stringent controls on their distribution than the federal government generally requires, and have been contested in that. But with contraception and abortion drugs, there are concerns, first of all, about FDA licensure of those drugs that has similarly been challenged. And generally, their licensure has been upheld and they're available. But, the degree to which, even as licensed products, there are restrictions that the federal government might put on their distribution, that is another thing that is of concern. And certainly that is something that has become politicized in the public sphere. And, there's kind of a tragedy to that because we do see instances of women who have conditions for which carrying a child is dangerous for them and they're having difficulty obtaining treatment for that. And we see these kinds of difficulties being imposed by the states and are concerned about those being used as models to stand in the way of availability of vaccines as well. We have also seen in the past couple of years a lot of state actions beyond the outright ban on distribution in that Idaho health district. We've seen efforts by states to make certain kinds of vaccination mandates illegal. Montana has now successfully made it illegal for employers to mandate COVID-19 vaccinations for employees. That was initially overturned by a district court on various grounds, and then the Ninth Circuit surprisingly stepped in and said there's nothing that prevents a state from banning these private employer vaccination mandates, which have historically, there have been private employer vaccination mandates going back 50 years, and there hasn't been restrictions on them, but now we are seeing that. We're also seeing actions in Florida and Texas and Kansas, where the governments of those states are attempting to prosecute COVID-19 manufacturers or impanel grand juries and investigate them and put them through that questioning process with the idea that they might be charged with something. And I believe in Texas and Kansas, there's a process underway with the intent of bringing some kind of civil or criminal charges against the vaccine manufacturers for making the Pfizer is the main target of these, for making the COVID-19 vaccines with all sorts of kind of calumny and implications of wrongdoing that very much track the sort of conspiracy theories that you see on the internet, that these vaccines are actually harmful and not helpful, and the manufacturers knew these things. So there are a lot of processes that the states can use. The federal government hasn't used those processes as of yet, but they could. They could initiate federal investigations into the vaccine manufacturers and say, okay, we're going to drag you before a federal grand jury, and we're going to consider all sorts of indictments or, look for things that we consider conduct that can be punished. And that is, that every one of these things is a concern that we have, particularly given the tenor of a lot of misinformation about vaccines and the positions of some of the people who have repeated some of that misinformation and the fact that they may be given outsized influence over the political process in the coming years.
So the question then becomes, what can we do? What can the public, everyday people do to prevent something like this from happening, if anything?
Well, I think a great deal of it, this question of optics and perception, and, it's a very unfortunate thing that when we have state action, a state impaneling a grand jury and saying, okay, we're going to investigate the manufacturer and accusing them of wrongdoing, that by itself is going to be very dissuasive to people. And I think the counter to that is that we give people the right to be vaccinated, whether some individual thinks that vaccines are harmful or not. If that person isn't going to be required to be vaccinated necessarily, and there are exemptions, and in particular, the states that have kind of brought these actions also tend to have very broad exemptions to vaccination. They have perhaps philosophical exemptions where you don't even really need to articulate a reason other than you don't want to be vaccinated. So, they already have plenty of outs for people who don't want to be vaccinated. And there's an argument to be made that, after providing those outs for people who don't want to be vaccinated, parents who do want to vaccinate their children, physicians who do want to recommend vaccination to their pediatric patients should have the right to do so. And the government shouldn't kind of put its thumb on the scale in the other direction. And, we're already going to be dealing, I think, with a rhetorical thumb on the scale, with people in positions of power being able to say things without necessarily very effective channels of retort that are going to discourage vaccination. We don't need to have government take away people's rights to access vaccines if they want to be vaccinated. They voluntarily want to receive those treatments. One of the things that the Trump administration did in the first administration was to enact a right to try law. which
Yep.
allows people to have, in theory, broader access to experimental or clinical trial stage pharmaceutical products that, people have complained for a long time that, well, if you have cancer or if you have Alzheimer's or some other disease of that sort, and there's a potential cure that's being tested, and it takes many, many years to test, that, well, there's a legal barrier against having access to that during that period. And someone who's going to die of a disease, if they don't get some treatment, should be able to sort of try everything. And the administration did take the position that, yes, people in that state should be able to try things that are not licensed. More leeway to do that. And it seems to run counter to the notion that we're going to allow people to have access to things that aren't even necessarily licensed, because they as individuals want to make that choice in connection with their own condition. And there's also this sort of rhetoric that was very common during the COVID pandemic, where people opposed to vaccination mandates were saying, well, my body, my choice. Of course, that is historically a slogan that originates in the context of reproductive freedom. It was also used in the context of vaccine freedom. But my body, my choice also inherently implies the right to choose to be vaccinated. To the extent that there's any sort of thing that people can do, I think it's just to be vocal about defending the individual right to access vaccination, and that people have the ability to make that choice. The government shouldn't be able to tell you that you can't choose to be vaccinated. You can't choose for your children to be vaccinated if that is your choice as an individual or a parent.
Yeah, so interesting times that we are about to see, right? I think everybody's gearing up for all sorts of fights on all sorts of issues, not just public health, not just vaccines, but social issues, cultural issues, etc. Any parting words of wisdom, anything you want to lay out there for people to kind of, I don't know, make us feel a little bit better or a little more hopeful that maybe things will not be completely turned upside down, especially when it comes to our health with this administration and the people that are associated with it?
Well, the first thing I would say is that during the measles pandemic of 2019, which is now largely forgotten, there was a contingent of people prior to that who were kind of effectively being anti-vaccination with respect to measles vaccination. And that led to the recurrence of measles in this country. The Trump administration did respond to that with pro-vaccination messaging, even with the president himself saying, you've got to get the shots, you have no choice. So I think the administration is responsive to pressure on that aspect. And, it's kind of unfortunate to say, but I think the administration will be responsive to crisis that arises in response to an absence of vaccination if we do have vaccination numbers decline. And we've seen vaccination numbers declining throughout and since the pandemic started, in part because of factors relating to the pandemic and parents early on, when there were lockdowns, not being able to take their children to get vaccinated. And then later on, with the very successful building of mistrust in vaccines, we have seen declining vaccination rates. They're already dropping below levels of herd immunity in many places. So it's sort of only a matter of time before we have resurgence of diseases like measles, potentially polio. There have been, certainly cases of varicella, of pertussis, of tetanus that have had to be treated with extreme measures. And it's really only a matter of time, if vaccination rates drop low enough, where we'll have a situation like that's occurred in Samoa in 2019, when measles vaccination rates dropped very low and dozens of children died. And if you translate what happened in Samoa, which Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was involved in to the extent that he went and visited the island and met with people who were militating against vaccination. If you were to translate that to the population of the United States, you would see tens of thousands of children dying of measles. And that absolutely would reverse the course on any sort of anti-vaccine rhetoric, but it would come at a terrible cost.
Terrible, terrible indeed. Well, Brian, thank you so much for this. I think we'll be checking in with you as we go and as we see these things arise. And I certainly look forward to your work. I look forward to your third edition of your book, Vaccination, and Immunization Law. Really good read for anybody in public health with an inclination toward the law or with an inclination toward vaccination and everything that comes with it. I highly recommend it. That's coming up soon. And the reason that you and I met, the National Vaccine Law Conference as well. It's going to be interesting. Some interesting discussions are going to be had there too. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
And that's it for this special edition of Philly Public Health Chats. Thank you for joining us today and for listening to our discussion on the intersection of public health and presidential power. Before you go, remember to check out the College of Physicians of Philadelphia at collegeofphysicians.org for more resources, events, and updates. And if you're in Philly, don't miss a chance to visit the college's historic building located in downtown Philadelphia at 19 South 22nd Street. There you can visit the Butter Museum, home to fascinating educational exhibits on medical history, and the Historical Medical Library, which houses an impressive collection of rare texts and manuscripts. Thanks again for being part of this conversation. Please stay informed, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.